Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are breaking down a really impactful sermon delivered by Pastor Noel Sandesh at the Crown of Life Ministries in Bhopal. What we're looking at today is part one of a massive four-part series focused entirely on a concept that literally touches every single one of us: financial freedom. Now, whether you're completely new to theological perspectives on money, or this is something you study all the time, Pastor Sandesh's framework offers a genuinely fascinating look at the intersection of faith, wealth, and responsibility. Let's see how he kicks off this series. Right off the bat, the sermon hooks the audience by grounding the whole discussion in this ancient, completely undeniable reality from Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. It's a verse that carries a ton of weight, especially as he reads it to his congregation in Bhopal from the Hindi translation, stating clearly, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender." Pastor Sandesh uses this verse to point out a fundamental dynamic of the world we live in. Money establishes dominance. I mean, we see it everywhere, right? Rich people rule over the poor, rich countries rule over poor countries, and rich communities rule over poor communities. There's just this intrinsic, undeniable connection between wealth and authority. And because of that dynamic, finance becomes a highly sensitive topic, especially within a faith community. Money doesn't just sit there in a bank account. It literally defines our lives, our families, our status, and even our honor in society. For a lot of believers, talking about money is super uncomfortable because, as the sermon points out, a person's financial condition is very often viewed as a reflection of their spiritual condition. It's definitely a touchy subject, but it's one that we absolutely cannot ignore if we want to understand a kingdom standpoint on resources. And it brilliantly illustrates the balance the sermon is trying to strike right out of the gate. Proverbs 22, verse 2, which Pastor Sandesh also shares from the Hindi translation, reminds everyone of this profound equalizer. Rich and poor both meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. While wealth creates societal division and dominance, he emphasizes that God actually connects to both ends of the financial spectrum. God is the maker of everyone, regardless of what's in their bank balance. And that sets a huge foundation for us. Wealth isn't inherently evil, and poverty isn't inherently holy. God is sovereign over the whole thing. This brings us to a major conflict that Pastor Sandesh addresses, which we can call the believer's dilemma, because there are two very dangerous extremes you'll find in congregations today. On one extreme, you have the poverty mindset. These are believers who say Jesus is everything, but they use that as an excuse to completely ignore their finances. They just accept financial struggle as some kind of spiritual burden and never try to improve their situation. Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the greed mindset. These believers act like money is everything. They're willing to do literally anything: lie, cheat, steal, even turn to crime, just to acquire wealth. And honestly, both of these extremes miss the mark entirely.
So the natural question arises, and it's one I want to pose directly to you right now. As a believer, what should be our approach towards finance? If we aren't supposed to ignore our financial reality, but we're also not supposed to obsess over it to the point of corruption, where is that middle ground? Well, to find the biblical solution, Pastor Sandesh first forces his audience to confront the harsh, unfiltered realities of a world that lacks money.
And these realities are incredibly sobering. The sermon lays out some raw examples of how a lack of money causes deep, worldly pain and systemic corruption. First, people literally die because they don't have money for medical treatments. Families know exactly what operation or medication could save their loved one, but without the funds, they're just forced to give up. Second, super brilliant individuals stay in poverty because they can't afford a good education. And perhaps most frustratingly, people with immense wealth but zero academic merit can simply buy leaked NEET exam papers, securing their kids' unearned admissions into top MBBS medical colleges. Money, in the worldly sense, completely dictates who survives and who succeeds. To drive this home, Pastor Sandesh asks his congregation to do a really powerful exercise in empathy. I want you to imagine, just for a second, living the life of the poorest person you personally know. Think about their daily struggle, the pain, the constant uncertainty. The sermon even references severely malnourished children in parts of Africa, describing these horrifying scenes where vultures literally wait nearby. It's a visceral, heartbreaking image, but it's designed to connect the audience emotionally with the severe, actual pain of extreme poverty. To bring this reality a little closer to home and to shatter any lingering apathy, he uses this striking comparison. The cost of just one single plate of biryani at a five-star restaurant is equivalent to a poor family's entire grocery budget for 10 days. Think about that. The purpose of highlighting this massive contrast isn't just to make people feel guilty, though. It's to urge believers to deeply, deeply honor the resources they currently have in their pockets, because every single rupee has weight, power, and potential. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the sermon uses the book of Ecclesiastes to show that poverty actively limits your influence, no matter how gifted you might be. Looking at chapter 9, verses 13 through 16, a passage whose meaning echoes super strongly as he shares its Hindi translation. It tells the story of a small city that was besieged by a great king. Inside the city was a poor, wise man who used his wisdom to save the entire place. But what happened? No one remembered him, simply because he was poor. Pastor Sandesh points out that even great, life-saving wisdom is tragically ignored or despised when it comes from a place of poverty. Having influence really does require resources. Okay, this brings us to a massive theological shift in the sermon found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. When delivered to the congregation in its Hindi translation, the impact of this text is pretty undeniable. Jesus became poor so that through his poverty you might become rich. Pastor Sandesh teaches here that Jesus intentionally took on poverty, trading his heavenly riches for earthly struggle, specifically so that believers could experience kingdom prosperity. This directly challenges that whole idea that Christians are meant to be perpetually poor. According to this framework, Jesus already paid the price of poverty. Furthermore, he backs this up with Psalm 35, verse 27. It's this foundational pillar that declares, "Let the Lord be magnified, who has pleasure in the prosperity of his servant." He highlights that God doesn't just, tolerate our financial success, he actually takes pleasure in our prosperity. But notice that specific word used right at the end of the verse, servant. That word is critical because it perfectly transitions us into the right way to handle wealth. Because to experience true, God-given financial freedom, Pastor Sandesh argues that a believer actually has to adopt the mindset and character of a servant. So, what does that character look like? He breaks it down into 3 simple steps. Number 1, you are entirely dependent on the master. Number 2, you recognize that your future also depends completely on the master. And number 3, you love and serve only the master. You see, true financial freedom isn't about arrogance or self-reliance. It requires deep humility and acknowledging exactly where the blessing comes from. So the crucial point is this: God doesn't just hand out money so people can hoard it like dragons. God blesses believers with finances so they can fulfill specific, divinely appointed responsibilities. Money is just a tool, and this shifts the focus entirely away from merely having money for the sake of having money toward actually understanding its true, God-given purpose in a believer's life. The sermon clearly outlines these responsibilities by categorizing them into the 3 purposes of wealth. First, it's to live a comfortable life. And Pastor Sandesh makes a very distinct point here. Comfortable, not luxurious. It's about having your needs met without excess, crazy indulgence. Second, it's to fund God's kingdom, dedicating resources to spiritual work. And third, it's to reveal the love of Jesus to those in need, stepping in where the world has failed them. This is that balanced, biblical approach to money that perfectly avoids both the poverty and the greed mindsets we talked about earlier. Zooming in closer on that second purpose, funding the kingdom, the sermon references Malachi 3:10, emphasizing the power of this command: bring all the tithes into the storehouse and see if I will not pour out a blessing. Pastor Sandesh connects this scripture to the active financial support of the church and God's work. It's a reciprocal relationship detailed in the text. By dedicating a portion of wealth to the kingdom, believers position themselves for an outpouring of continued blessing from God. And to illustrate the third purpose, helping those in need, the sermon points back to the historical biblical precedent set by the early church in Acts chapter 4. Anchoring this in verses 34 and 35, it says, "There were no needy persons among them. Resources were distributed to anyone who had need." This is exactly what happens when a community of believers understands the true purpose of wealth. By liquidating assets and sharing resources, they systematically eliminated poverty within their community. This is the ultimate goal of financial freedom in the kingdom context. Let's see how this all builds together into what Pastor Sandesh calls the flow of financial blessing. It's like a waterfall. It starts at the individual level and cascades outward. Step 1, the blessing impacts you and your family, providing that comfortable life. Step 2, out of your abundance, you bless your church, funding the kingdom. Step 3, because the church is resourced by its members, it can now extend that blessing to the world, helping those in deep need. It's this beautifully structured, outward-flowing system of generosity. But here's the reality check. None of this flow can happen if the spring is dry.
You literally must be financially blessed in order to share resources. You cannot help the church, and you cannot help the needy if you yourself are trapped in poverty. By framing it this way, Pastor Sandesh completely validates the pursuit of financial freedom. It is not selfish to want to be financially stable. In fact, according to this sermon, it's a prerequisite for fulfilling your kingdom responsibilities.
As we wrap up this explainer on part 1 of the series, Pastor Sandesh leaves us with a highly provocative thought to self-reflect upon. Look at your own life and ask yourself, are your finances currently funding only your personal comfort, or are they actively funding God's kingdom and helping those in need? It's a challenging metric for evaluating where you truly stand on your path to financial freedom. Keep that question in mind, because there is so much more to unpack as we continue to explore this series. Thanks so much for joining me for this breakdown, and keep seeking that deeper understanding.